G'day. Today I'm going to answer a question from Greg Olson on the Central Coast Get Up Action Network. He asks, how can a sovereign country value its resources so it knows how much to invest without causing inflation? Presumably, that wasn't the exact wording of the question, that's my understanding of it. So basically trying to figure out how much to spend because we're not trying to balance the budget, so how much can we spend? So basically the identified goal of a government under Aber Lerner's functional finance economic model, upon which modern monetary theory draws, is that the government should spend to maintain an aggregate spending level in the economy that will result in full employment. And full employment just means that anyone who wants to work has an opportunity to do so and get paid for it. So why is that the goal? Why full employment? The foregone output from unsold or unpurchased labor, it dwarfs all other output, all other forms of foregone output. So you might say, okay, well, like we could have grown a couple of tons of extra wheat last year. We had some fallow soil, and the output of the soil, we could have exported some more wine, or we had some hectares where we could have had extra sheep and had more wool. So all of those things are like foregone output, and they're pretty hard to judge, but they're also completely dwarfed by unemployment. If you have involuntary unemployment, meaning that there were people who wanted to work, which is output, and that they didn't have the opportunity to do so, that's catastrophic. Okay, so Aber Lerner, and like that's not controversial. Like the idea that unemployment is a catastrophe is, or the target that everyone should have a job is universally accepted. So then we say, okay, like we've got to spend to maintain full employment. Aber Lerner then, and the sort of Keynesians, find it difficult to see then how can we judge how much to spend in order to have aggregate spending, meaning both public and private sector spending, at the exactly the right level to maintain full employment. So what modern monetary theory introduces into the economic discussion is the concept of a buffer stock. And Bill Mitchell, I guess, coined this term in modern monetary theory, but Warren Mosler was also on the same track, although they were working independently at first. Bill Mitchell in the 70s noticed that the government had a wool price guarantee. And what this was, that the price of wool would fluctuate, and when there was a glut of wool, the price would go down so low that the farmers couldn't sell the wool at a high enough price that they could keep the lights on. They were going to go broke, and that would destroy the wool production capacity, so that when there was a non-glut, when the market recovered, the price came back up, we wouldn't have the ability to produce wool anymore, because they couldn't feed the sheep in the meantime, that kind of thing. So the government said, okay, well, they went and they talked to the farmers, and they said, hey, what's the price that you need to sell the wool at to keep the lights on? And they said, well, it's X dollars per bale, or I don't know, it was in the 70s. Did they have shillings then? So X number of shillings, whatever. Okay, so the government then went and purchased all the wool and kept it in big warehouses. And then when the market started to recover, the government would sell it off. And that's a buffer stock. It sets the floor price for wool. And Bill Mitchell said, okay, we could do the same thing for labor, because if the wage that the private sector will pay for labor goes below a certain point, the productive capacity of the labor is destroyed, meaning that people they get depressed. They can't pay the rent. They can't feed their children. They can't, the productive capacity of that labor is destroyed if the rate that the private sector will pay for labor dips to below a certain point. And so rather than going out and saying, okay, we're going to hire people at market rate, meaning, okay, we want to inject some stimulus to maintain aggregate demand at the point that will ensure full employment, we're going to go out and hire all the architects, and hire all the software developers, and hire all the engineers, and hire all the civil service, all of the council workers, and all of the people that couldn't get jobs in the private sector. We're going to go and hire them all at the rate that they would otherwise be paid by the private sector. So an engineer gets $120,000, forklift driver gets $90,000, the nurse, whatever a nurse would get paid in the private sector, maybe they're getting 75, whatever it is. So, teachers, I think, between 80 and 90, depending on how senior they are. So they're all of these sort of market rates. And so that's the sort of the Keynesian model, is that we inject stimulus into the economy, but people are being hired at market rates. So Bill Mitchell said, okay, rather than hiring at market rate, we're going to set the floor price for labor. What do you need to keep the lights on, make sure you're happy, and what he calls this is a socially inclusive minimum wage. It means you have enough to keep the lights on, plus, go and do something with the kids. Go to a cafe without having to beg your friends to pay for you every time, right? So that's the socially inclusive minimum wage. So we don't hire, everyone gets hired at the same rate when they go into the buffer stock. And it's just saying, instead of keeping a buffer stock of unemployed people, let's just keep a buffer stock of employed people. And that has a couple of advantages. First of all, people have to show up to get their payment. If you said, oh, well, when they go into the buffer stock, we'll just give them the social inclusive minimum wage, but they don't have to show up. All right, well, how do you know whether or not they've been employed in the private sector then? Because people can't be in two places at once. So we want something where they have to show up and trade their time in. Because otherwise we might find that people are leaving the unemployed buffer stock and still collecting their job guarantee wage, but the private sector is injecting stimulus by paying them as well, and then we would lose control of inflation. So it would diminish the impact of the policy as an inflation anchor. So they say, okay, let's keep a buffer stock of unemployed people, of employed people. They have to show up to get their wage, but if they show up, they get paid. There's no means test. We don't check if they've got private sector employment, because if people want to work 80 hours, that's the output, right? So if people want to work 80 hours a week and they can't work 80 hours a week, then there's foregone output. So we don't judge whether or not people should be working. It's just if they turn up, we give them a job. Then also we capture some of that output. If we said, okay, people are willing to work 40 hours, we're going to keep a buffer stock, set the floor price, but people don't have to turn up, we're just going to give them the money anyway, we would still not be capturing any of that output. So we wouldn't be able to divert that foregone output to any public purpose. So, but if people show up and then we give them something to do, like, hey, you're a nurse, you can run a training program at the local library. Hey, you're a musician, you can teach the kids how to play guitar. You're a policy analyst, we're going to get you to work on some health and safety documents that we need, that are in the backlog for the council that we haven't had done. So all of these sorts of things, they're good because if the private sector heats up, or when the private sector heats up and recovers, the job guarantee or this buffer stock needs to yield the labour to the private sector. The government doesn't want to hold on to the wool in the warehouse, right? It wants to sell it off when it gets past the price that it paid for it. So as soon as the private sector is willing to pay more than the socially inclusive minimum wage, the buffer stock of unemployed people needs to yield that labour. So we don't want to have a project that's too complicated or long running, right? If you're building a bridge and then the private sector heaps up, you've only got half the bridge built, you have to yield the labour. So you need to design the jobs such that the buffer stock of employed people can yield that labour when the private sector heats up. But by definition, that means that because you're purchasing the foregone output meaning that the public sector, permanent public sector jobs weren't employing these people, and the private sector wasn't employing them either. If you purchase just that foregone output, you are by definition spending exactly the right amount to maintain aggregate spending at the full employment level. So if you pay anyone who cannot be employed by the private sector a socially inclusive minimum wage, and then that wage is fixed regardless of their training, qualifications, whatever. This is a minimum wage payment that offsets the business cycle and keeps the lights on and maintains productive capacity of labour. Then that's how you judge. And you would have to, just the same as the government had to go out and find out from the farmers when they did the wool guarantee, how much do you need in order to feed the sheep and make sure that when the market heats up you can still produce some wool. You would have to have an econometrics boffin go out and find out what the minimum wage should be. So there is an analytical component to this. You have to figure out what the actual minimum socially inclusive minimum wage is. It's going to change over time. In this today in Australia, you might say it's $40,000. It might be different in Brazil. It might be different in the UK. But there is a rate, and what you'd find actually is because the job guarantee acts as a stabilizer, it acts as an inflation anchor, because there is a fixed rate where the sort of average output that people are willing to provide in the service of others, meaning their working output. Currently, people seem to be pretty happy with about 38 hours a week. Maybe in future, with increased automation, people might not be happy with 38 hours. They only want to work for 15 hours, whatever that is. So that you can then fix the value of the dollar to the time. So you sort of anchoring the dollar value to time, which is a very stable way to value the dollar. So you would find less inflation, and the socially inclusive minimum wage would be relatively fixed. It would need to be adjusted from time to time, but that would just be, like the Fair Work Commission adjusts the minimum wage anyway. So that's a political process. But once you've set that fixed minimum wage, you pay anyone who walks through the door that wage. And that is by definition, you're buying all the foregone output. So by definition, you're then setting the amount of government spending at the level required to maintain full employment. Any tweaks are for other resources like productive output of wool, or productive output of wheat, or mining extraction, whatever. That's fiddling around the edges. The foregone output from labour dwarfs everything else. So I hope that policy, the buffer stock of employed people, is called the job guarantee. So that's what the job guarantee is. That is the central policy plank. It's the central policy outcome of modern monetary theory. And that specifically avoids the problem of having to judge, month to month, are we overstimulating the economy or not? So it's primarily an economic policy. It's not really a social justice policy. It's primarily an economic policy. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, feel free to ask more in the comments. Thanks very much, and I'll see you later. Bye.